self-sufficient. Hello and welcome to our next podcast, number 3 I think it is. I've lost count already, but there you go. I'm very, very fortunate to have a friend JP, who is here with me, and he's the guy that does all the twiddling and pressing buttons and sets things up. He's also very inquisitive, and he tends to ask me questions all the time about various things. Met him a few years ago when he wanted to learn about gardening, and I was in a position where I was happy to help him along, and he did a lot of the physical sides of things for a year or two, and now he's moved on to the technical whiz-kid stuff with photography and computers and microphones and so on. So JP, we call him. Paul, I call him. So here we go.
I've had a look around your property and it's amazing. I mean, we're in a large greenhouse now. Is this new, this greenhouse? Yeah?
Yes, this is about 3 years old. I built this 3 years ago, and it's a large construction, about 7 metres by just under 5 metres.
Wow.
Entirely devoted to the growing of food, and it's developed in such a way that because our property is on a relatively steep slope, about a 1 in 5 slope, that's about 20 to 25 degrees, most of it. It contains raised beds, but they're made level in such a way that the lower half is raised up level with the upper part, and each of the beds is reached from a narrow path on each side of it.
That's about 15 beds I can see here. Individual beds. I mean, there are big beds split into 3, and they're all surrounded by kind of silver corrugated iron and filled with earth. What, 4 foot high?
Yeah.
Some of them, yeah.
Yeah.
And you've got some plants started off already, I can see. What are those at the back there?
Yeah, so we'll up at the top
flowers
there in the upper bed. We've got some first early potatoes. There's just 6 plants there of first early potatoes. I've also got some of those in large pots in the small greenhouse. But those we'll be eating very soon now. Generally speaking, by May you have to wait another 3 or 4 weeks to get any out of the ground outside, but by having them in the greenhouse, we'll be eating our own new potatoes in the early part of May. Yes, there are
How big is it, this space?
The space is, well, each of the beds is about 2.4 metres, that's 8 foot long, and 1.2 metres, that's 4 foot wide. There are 3 of those, and one long bed, which again is 1.2 metres, about 4 foot wide. It's a fraction narrower, that one, actually, because it's only accessible from one side, because it runs right along on a slope.
You could get about 4 cars in here, couldn't you?
Yes, it would be about the size of
to give you an idea
a 3
of
or 4 car garage. It would be an equivalent size.
And the height of?
The height is fairly high. Obviously, being on a sloping site, from here it looks as if it's about 20 foot, that's about 5 or 6 metres higher than where we are. It's not quite as much as that because the slope gives a slightly false impression. But at the back it's about nearly 3 metres high. And down here, the reason for that is that if you have a greenhouse or a polytunnel which is too low, the temperatures at certain times of the year get far too high and will virtually kill anything within it, and you've got to water those areas even twice a day in late May and June and July. Whereas in here, because they've got plenty of height, the very high temperatures will only be right up the top corner.
And I can see lots of
Yes,
young plants around me. You've got...
Yeah, those are all carrots.
And those are in the
And
trays there?
these are young lettuces.
All right.
And what we do is we actually sow 3 or 4 different varieties of things at the same time. And the benefit of that is that they all mature at slightly different lengths of time before they're ready for consumption. So in the pots beside you, for instance, there are about 5 pots there. Each of those is a different type of carrot. And that's a soaking tub.
Full of water.
With the water. And this is another soaking tub. What I do is I don't actually water from the top. These are root crops, generally speaking, which if you just water from the top, very often the water won't get right down to the roots once the plants have established. They're fine when they're at the seed stage. You can then give them a sprinkle of water on the top. But once they've got their roots right down, and these are deep pots, they're about 10 inches, which is about 250 millimetres deep, these pots.
These are all 22.5 kilogram tubs.
Yes, that particular tub there, which is I use for soaking the pots in, I change the pots in there every 5 days, so I move them around. So one of those is in the pot, in that soaking pot for 5 days. Those actually are from a local farmer, and he was throwing them out. They're a single-use plastic, which is unbelievably wasteful because all that had in it was an energy food for sheep or cattle. And then at the end of the time when they've actually licked the goodness out of them, they just throw them away. Well, I don't like things thrown away if it can be avoided.
Reusing, recycling.
Reuse as much as possible.
Upcycling.
And then eventually they will go into the recycling, but at the moment.
So, I don't know whether I should ask a gentleman this question. Your age?
Well, let's put it this way, I'm the wrong side of 80.
You've been gardening and landscaping for years. So, how long?
Well, I was brought up by parents who did believe in fresh fruit and vegetables. And although our diet was relatively conventional, and that was perfectly reasonable in those days, the meat and 2 veg was considered the norm. We're talking about the period just after the Second World War, and but my folks always agreed with lots of fresh fruit and vegetables, and so I was actually brought up by people who were growing a major part of our vegetables, not really from a young age. I learned landscaping myself. I became a fireman when I was 20 years of age, and I spent over 30 years as a whole-time fireman.
Okay, so in what role? There are different roles in the fire service, aren't there?
Yes.
And so you were a firefighter?
I was what's now called a firefighter. It was just fireman when I joined.
Okay. Yeah.
Because now that the ladies are part of the team, obviously they had to change it from firemen, and now that's why they're now called firefighters. Perfectly reasonable. So they've changed the name to incorporate the ladies who now are in the service, and as long as they have the physical capability that is required of a firefighter, that's fine. It's not a problem. They did actually reduce some of the physical demand when they applied to be a firefighter when ladies joined, but they're very close to what it was when I joined.
And you would have used ropes and knots, which is where your knowledge of ropes and knots comes from, I guess.
Yes, partly, but also I did quite a lot of sailing as a youngster. When you're sailing, you really need to know a certain number of good basic knots. Things like the reef and the clove hitch and the bowline are essential knots to be able to tie under all sorts of conditions.
The Becky bend.
Yeah, all sorts of things. And they're all very useful. The ability to join lines of both equal and unequal thickness are very important.
And chains, I understand.
Chains, yes, they're fairly important. Chains are important as far as anchorage is concerned, because it's important.
How many ropes and knots do you think you know?
Oh, 20 at least. Obviously, I've built up the ability. I mean, as a junior officer, part of my job was teaching knots and lines and so on with people. People have a misunderstanding about ropes and knots and lines. A rope is 120 fathoms long, 720 feet.
Really? I didn't
And
know that.
anything cut off that is called a line. So that's why it's called ropes and lines and knots. Because a rope is the standard length that used to be used by sailing ships for anchorage. And the chain would have been from the first 20 feet, 6 meters or so from the anchor itself, and obviously with very large boats, they'd have all chain all the way up to the boat. But shall we say a medium or small yacht would have a rope of varying lengths according to what type of waters they were sailing in.
I've become fairly familiar with your land, having worked here and learned under your tutorship, which by the way was brilliant. I just wondered how big this property is, your land.
Our land that we've got here is just over 1 acre, which is just under half a hectare. If you look at the productive land per person on this planet, there is approximately 1 hectare, which is about 2.2 acres, per person on the planet of productive land. In other words, we have about a quarter, as there are 2 of us that we're feeding here, we have about a quarter of that proportion of land.
And you put it to really good use, I have to say. I mean, I walk around from one end to the other, from corner to corner. Every bit of land is put to productive use.
Well, obviously we are using some land in other places. So we produce a little bit of hay, but I use that as the basis for our hotbed system, which is used first thing in the early part of the year. We make hay just as a way of keeping grass, and then we soak it to help the hotbed get going.
We did a video on that, didn't we?
We did indeed.
And the reason you have this land and why you grow so many vegetables is because you're vegan.
Yes.
An ethical vegan, I understand.
Yes.
What's an ethical vegan?
Well, an ethical vegan is somebody who is very much aware of the world implications, the whole planet implications of a diet or a way of life. If you're an ethical vegan, it means that you don't necessarily have an excessive amount of fresh fruit or vegetables flown in from Africa or some other far-off country. You can be a vegan perfectly well and eat nothing but pineapples and mange-tout peas grown in Kenya and flown overnight into this country. You can still be a vegan and do that. But I consider that to be excessive. And in terms of climate change, it's obviously really bad news to have relatively small quantities of fresh food flown around the world.
No animals?
We don't have any animals.
And you don't eat animals?
No, I don't eat animals. I used to. I was brought up in a conventional family, in conventional systems with meat and 2 veg. But there are huge differences now because my parents didn't have any research behind them to know what was the correct food for a human being to eat. Luckily, we've had some fantastic research science done over the last 30 years or so, and those research scientists have looked into all the sort of anthropological history. Basically, they've looked back at the diet which is natural for humans to consume. And there are people who erroneously think that we have actually evolved to eat meat. Well, to actually evolve from one thing to another takes tens of millions of years, and we know that our diet about 3.5 million years ago, and this is from scientific research done on the remains of creatures who lived at that time, we know that we were a frugivorous ape, a slender frugivorous ape whose principal diet was fruit, nuts, leaves, twigs, little tiny bits off the ends, the buds.
A frugivorous ape.
Frugivorous, principally eating about 80% of fruit and buds to produce the fruit.
So it's like a tall, thin monkey that eats fruit and vegetables.
That's right.
I think you've just described me perfectly.
Yes, Paul. Serious action must be taken on climate change within this decade.